Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. At the very core of this essay of Nietzsche's Truth and Lying in an Extramoral Sense lies an insight in, you might say, a diagnosis of the human condition that we live in that has to do with these three themes connected together of rationality, abstraction, or the use of schemas, schemata in the plural in Greek, and what he calls anthropomorphism. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche tells us is that, metaphor is really foundational, and we human beings are, metaphorical by our very nature. That's part of what our intellects do. We do this through language, and even through the way in which we conceptualize on the one end and how we sense things on the other end. That's all productive, right? And then he talks about a sort of forgetting of the fact that we engaged in metaphors, and there's kind of a consolidating, like coins that are just exchanged back and forth, but the faces have worn off. Now, what he's talking about here goes beyond that, because that productive side then merges and morphs into something that's in a certain way much more productive on a higher level, but also more restrictive. This is where truth is not just a flash of insight, but something that we can come to rely upon over and over again with predictability, with an exchangeability. This is where the rational is actually an achievement. But it's also, for Nietzsche, somewhat stifling, as we'll see. So he talks about this shortly after his famous discussion of what is truth, a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, anthropomorphisms. A little bit beyond that, he says, as a rational being, the human being, right, forget the metaphorical origins of things, and as a rational being, we put our actions under the rule of abstractions. He no longer lets himself be carried away by sudden impressions, by intuitions. He first universalizes these impressions into less colorful, cooler concepts. Now, the fact that they're less colorful and cooler means that in certain respects, they're more usable. They don't cost as much to work with. If I can be understood by my companions very easily because we're sort of turning the concepts and the words that we use into something that is much less about, metaphor and sparkle and, flash and all that sort of cool stuff, and more into something that serves a purpose, I can get a lot more done. So he says, he hitches the wagon of his life and actions to them. Everything that sets man off from the animal depends on this capacity to dilute the concrete metaphors, to forget these concrete metaphors, and to dilute them into schemas, schemata, right, in plural. So he says, in the realm of such schemata, something is possible that might never succeed under the united first impressions. And here's where we get to something really interesting. We build up an entire world. This is only possible by starting to work with things as abstractions, as schemas, as getting away from the real, from the individual, from how things are in the way that we experience them originally and the way that we talk about them originally. Now, this happens over the course of generations, not just individual human beings in a state of nature or anything like that. But he says, what are we able to build up? A pyramidal order according to castes and classes. We have social distinctions. We can call these people higher and these people lower beneath them. And we can say this role, that role, this role. And they're connected in different ways. He says a new world of laws, privileges, subordinations. These are relations human beings bear to each other. We also, as so many people have pointed out, we also apply this to the rest of the world. We talk about the animal kingdom, great metaphor right there, right? And we talk about, animals behaving in certain ways, and we liken them to us. We make sense of them and the rest of the world in relation to these new schemata that we're working with. So he says, boundary determinations, which now stands opposite the other, concrete world of primary impressions, and we think, here's where it gets really interesting. He says that as opposed to the concrete world of impressions, where we're having our experiences, right? He says, we see this other world, the world of abstractions, the world of schemata, the world that is revealed to us by our rational and intellectual capacities and consolidated in language as the more solid, more universal, more familiar, more human, and therefore as a regulatory and imperative world. And over time, this comes to take on a greater strength. And after a while, that's the only way that people can really think. At least the majority of people, and kids think differently, but that we sort of beat that out of them. Or we cajole it out of them. Or we reward and punish it out of them. We find ways to stifle that and to get them to fit into these schemata that we have developed. So he calls this a great structure of concepts, and he says it has the rigid regularity of a Roman columbarium, has an aura of that severity and coldness typical of mathematics. The very notion that we could use mathematics to model the universe, Nietzsche here is saying, is really a reflection of what's going on here in the way in which we have used our intellects and the ways in which we've developed these codes, these apparati, these assemblages of schemata. So he calls this the residue of a metaphor. And the question that we have to ask then is, well, what is truth? Because this is about truth and lying in an extramoral sense. What does truth become? And Nietzsche says, well, there's a couple ways of looking at it in this discussion. He says, truth becomes, in this dice game of concepts, using each die as designating, counting its spots accurately, forming the correct labels, never violating the caste system and sequence of rank classifications. So truth becomes playing the game properly, following the rules. Rules which are, in the end, not quite arbitrary, but certainly contingently formed. They don't reflect an absolute of the universe or even of human nature. They just reflect having developed within these schema. What else is truth? He goes on and he talks about truth is something that we find. He says, if someone hides an object behind a bush, then seeks and find it there, that seeking and finding is not very laudable. But it is that way with the seeking and finding of truth within the rational sphere. If I define the mammal, and then after examining a camel declare, see, a mammal, a truth is brought to light, but, Nietzsche says, it is of limited value. What makes it of limited value? Here is where we get to the anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism means making things after the nature of the human. And Nietzsche is saying here that what we do, very similar to like what bees do in making their honeycombs, is we shape the universe and of course ourselves and our societies after ourselves. It's like we're continually building ourselves out by way of these schemata, by way of concepts, and into these massive grids, these massive organized, what can we call them? Massive, he's got this Roman columbarium, the mighty architecture, an infinitely complicated cathedral on foundations that move like flowing water. There's a beautiful metaphor for you right there. What does that? We as human beings do that, and we don't do it with wax or honey or things like that. We do it with thoughts and language, and we get people, other people, to get on board with this, and it's all part of one big anthropomorphic project, he says. So he goes on and he says, the investigator observes the whole world as linked with man as the infinitely refracted echo of a primeval sound. Man is the reproduction and copy of an archetype, man. His procedure is to hold up man as measure of all things. But we forget that these things present themselves to us as pure objects. And so he says, we are an architectural genius. We build out from the much more delicate material of the concepts, which we must fabricate out of our own self, this entire world. And that is where we locate truth. So truth is not something that you could say exceeds the human. As a matter of fact, truth is a product of the human, and we consolidate it into these structures that undergird and run through our entire social matrix.